Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where your current location is. My name is Mats Engman, and I will be your moderator today in this webinar about the trilateral cooperation between United States, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. I will start by briefly introduce some of our webinar guidelines to you. You that are attending this webinar will not be able to turn your audio or video on during this session. Everyone attending the event must respect each other's opinions, and we do not accept discriminatory or offensive comments in the chat or the Q&A function. If a question is deemed offensive, inappropriate, or irrelevant, it will be dismissed. And we reserve the right to remove someone from this webinar if they break these rules. If you have a question for one or all of the speakers during the webinar, please feel free to direct those questions to the Q&A function in the panel below here on Zoom. There is, of course, a possibility due to time restrictions that the speakers will not have time to answer everybody's question, and we hope you understand that. Over to our webinar. Together with our partner organization, the Korea Defense Veterans Association in the United States, we at IDSP are very pleased to host this joint event on a very important, significant, and highly topical issue of trilateral cooperation between the United States, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. The last couple of weeks have seen a flurry of high-level meetings and discussions related to East Asia security, and in particular, issues related to China, North Korea, and a possibly increased cooperation between these three countries, US, Japan, and South Korea. Japan and South Korea's national security have been and continue to be inextricably interlaced by common threats and both countries' security relationship with the United States. North Korea, a primary foreign policy concern for South Korea, and a major challenge to the US and Japan national security, has kept advancing its both conventional and nuclear capabilities. And China has become more powerful and assertive than ever. Additionally, both Japan and South Korea are an integral part of the American military alliance system in Asia. But unresolved acrimonies between the Republic of Korea and Japan have impeded relations between the two nations. Animosities between Tokyo and Seoul affect bilateral relations, which subsequently trickle down and impede smooth trilateral relations with both nations' primary security partner, the United States. A military more advanced North Korea, an incomparably more powerful China, have made deeper trilateral cooperation between these three countries both more important, more relevant, and maybe even more possible. ISDP and KDVI are therefore honored to welcome today a distinguished panel of experts to guide us in this complex web of interacting factors. I will now introduce our speakers one at a time before they make the presentation. And I start by welcoming Mr. Randall Shriver. Mr. Shriver is the chairman of the board of Project 2049 Institute and a partner at Pacific Solutions. He is also a lecturer for Stanford University's Stanford in Washington program, and he is on the board of advisor to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and board of directors of the US-Taiwan Business Council. Just prior, Mr. Shriver served for 2 years as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security, where he was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense on matters related to the Indo-Pacific region. Previously, Mr. Shriver served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific Affairs, where he was responsible for China, Taiwan, Mongolia, Hong Kong, etc. Prior to his civilian service, he served as an active duty Navy intelligence officer, including on deployment in support of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Mr. Shriver had also served as an attaché in the US embassies in Beijing and Ulaanbaatar. He has won numerous military and civilian awards for the US government and was recently presented with the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, the highest award a civilian can be awarded. Please, Mr. Shriver, more than welcome, and the word is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and very honored to be joined by such distinguished colleagues on this virtual panel and to discuss a very important topic. Let me start by underscoring that quality trilateral relations, to the extent they're possible, are important to the United States. I think they're important for the reasons laid out in the introduction because of the security environment and the common threats. But I think we need to understand the trajectory also. It's of increasing importance. I think we have historically said poor relations between Japan and South Korea are awkward for the United States. Our two very close security partners and allies not getting along is awkward and creates obstacles and makes communications clumsy, cumbersome. And I think the mentality is it put us in a suboptimal position to deal with a variety of challenges, including security challenges. I think we need to evolve that thinking and understand it's not just that we are in a suboptimal position. In fact, we may not be positioned to meet our greatest security challenges going forward should this tension persist, and should we not be in a position to be able to address the problems and strengthen trilateral cooperation. The challenges of North Korea are changing, as was mentioned in the introduction. Certainly, from the United States perspective, we've tried just about every form of process. We've tried 4-party talks, 6-party talks. We've tried so-called strategic patience. We've tried summitry. I was the Department of Defense representative at both summits in Singapore and Hanoi. So we've tried all these things. And of course, North Korea has persisted in their pursuit of enhanced capabilities, including, as was mentioned, strategic nuclear capabilities. So at one point when we were talking about the common challenges this trilateral grouping faces, really the direct threats were to South Korea and Japan. Because of the evolution of North Korean capabilities now, clearly they're able to hold at risk the United States, some of our population centers and the like. So that threat has evolved, and that requires closer cooperation. But I think beyond that, the China challenge, again, it's not just that we're suboptimal if there's tension between South Korea and Japan. I'm not sure we can meet the long-term challenges of securing the free and open qualities of the Indo-Pacific unless there's better communication, better cooperation between the two countries, South Korea and Japan, and among the three in our trilateral cooperation. The nature of that challenge is so comprehensive. It's not just traditional security. It's not just securing the free and open qualities of the South China Sea or upholding rule of law and international norms. It's about export controls. It's about the tech competition. It's about how we protect intellectual property and technology that, due to the aggressive program of civil military fusion, the Chinese would otherwise incorporate what they are able to derive from us into their military modernization campaign. But it's how we also innovate together, how we remain in a cutting edge position so that we can out innovate and stay in a competitive position vis-a-vis China. And that's made much better, but I would argue that's even necessary to have better trilateral communication. So this is important to the United States, and in fact, maybe even stronger than that, it's necessary. I think number two, we need to be careful on the diagnosis of the problem. I think we all often shorthand the problem and say it's a history issue. Well, surely history is a big part of it. It's perhaps foundational to the problems between Japan and South Korea. But also clearly there's other things going on. Japan is a widely admired country in Asia, according to polls, for example, BBC polling. Japan is the most admired country in Asia. This includes countries that themselves had very difficult experiences with Japan in World War II. Now, I know South Korea's history predates that in the colonial period dating back to 1910. And by the way, that involves the United States and the diplomatic decisions made in the lead up to colonization, the Taft-Katsura Agreement. So we have our own ugly part of this history that we need to deal with. But we have to understand why there's an aberration there, why Japan is so widely admired, and why they have not been able to overcome these obstacles in the ROK-Japan relationship. And so I think we need to understand it's history plus. It's history plus an inability or an unwillingness on the part of political leaders to actually look past or accommodate history, or in some way deal with it in a manner that allows both countries to move forward in a positive direction. And so I think focusing on that nature of the problem, that it's about politics, it's about leadership, and it's about domestic politics in both countries, helps us to then think about how we approach the problem. It's not just a matter of defining history in the right way or interpreting history the right way. We also need to understand where the center of gravity of this tension is. I'll tell you where it's not. It's not in the defense ministries. It's not in the militaries. I, as was mentioned in the introduction, recently served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. I did a lot of work on the trilateral relationship, and every interaction underscored to me, everybody understands the importance of it. Everybody wants to cooperate. Everybody wants to enhance cooperation. And it's a matter of them being sort of unleashed to do that by their respective political leaders. I recall one of my visits to Seoul for a trilateral dialogue at my level, at the assistant secretary level. We were meeting at a time when, in fact, Kim Jong-un did one of the ballistic missile tests. And the Minister of Defense at the time in South Korea, Minister Jong, called us up into his office, previously unplanned and unscripted, and said, "This is why we're here meeting. This is why this is important." And by the way, he spoke in Japanese. Minister Jong trained at the Japanese War College and was a very good Japanese speaker. And so that really underscored for all of us on the security side why it was important. Just another anecdote, General Milley, on his very first day, in his very first hour, when he swore in as chairman at 8 a.m., he hosted a breakfast between himself and the Japanese Minister of Defense and the South Korean Chief of the General Staff's, his counterparts. So his very first act as chairman, his very first hour, he's meeting in a trilateral meeting with his Japanese and South Korean counterparts. So that's not where the problem is. It is a political issue, and therefore we have to understand how hard that is for particularly outsiders, for the United States to sort of go inside the box and deal with political issues at a domestic level is extraordinarily challenging, and in fact, probably not where our energies are best spent. So what is the role of the United States, and how should we be a contributor to improving this relationship? Again, let me start with what we should not do. I have never been a proponent for the United States to dive in and try to be a participant in defining history and constructing the correct historical narratives. I think that is just fraught with difficulty and not, frankly, the appropriate role of the United States. In the past, some have talked about having commissions of historians and having the United States participate. I think that's probably not a productive way forward. And I think in general, to think of the United States as a mediator is not the right framework. We can be a convener, we can be a troubleshooter, but I think a mediator is not the right framework. I traveled a lot as Assistant Secretary of Defense, and I would often hear from friends in Tokyo and friends in Seoul, you need to help us. You need to help us solve these problems. And I would always say the United States is more than willing to be a participant in these discussions, as long as you come to the table with sincerity and you understand the role we'll play. because really what they wanted is Tokyo wanted us to go to Seoul and tell the South Koreans why they were wrong and creating problems. And the South Koreans, of course, wanted us to go to Tokyo and tell them why they were wrong and why they were the main instigators of the problems. And that's not terribly productive. So again, the general framework of mediator is one I don't think is correct. So let me give you a short list of what I think the United States should be doing and can do. I think number one, we do need to sustain the dialogue, and in the military and the defense enterprises, the exercises we do, for example, tabletop exercises, I think are very important. Those kind of interactions help develop the common strategic outlook. But I think equally important, maybe more important, they help us develop habits of cooperation. They instill in each enterprise, in each respective country, an understanding that there's value in cooperating in a trilateral setting. So habits of cooperation are very important. I think number two, continue to enhance the modalities and the means of communication. Our ability, even in the military, even in a real-time operational setting, to communicate is somewhat constrained. So using technology, using advanced communications to really, again, demonstrate the value and the ease of communicating in a trilateral fashion will help us. This is sort of a if you build it, they will come approach. If we build the modalities, it'll be easier for all of us to turn to those means of communication in a time of a crisis or when we might really need it. Number three, I think continue to enhance real world cooperation, real world operations. Our efforts to enforce sanctions on the DPRK, I think, are a good model for multilateral cooperation, and within that, trilateral cooperation. Japan has played a critical role in hosting the air elements that are involved in enforcing the sanctions, and by that I mean trying to interdict and disrupt the illegal ship-to-ship transfers that the North Koreans are engaged in to evade sanctions. Continue to do that real-world work, because again, that enforces the value of our cooperation. It also helps to establish the habits of cooperation as to dialogue and exercises. Number four, I would say, force us into the future. Force us into the future. I think talking about the traditional challenges of the DPRK, that's always going to be a prominent, if not the most prominent, feature of our discussions. But I think we really need a dialogue that focuses on the future of the region, what the nature of the China challenge really is. And I know these discussions at first can be awkward and very sensitive. But look, the United States, including the Biden administration, have said this is the defining challenge of our time, that strategic competition is the defining characteristic and quality of our relationship with China. If we're going to get this right, if we're going to get export controls, the tech competition, the efforts to uphold international law, international norms, we need to be talking about how we do that as a trilateral grouping, as we do that within the context of each of our alliances. And I'll be very frank here, this is more advanced in Japan right now because of their view of China than it is in South Korea. But I think South Korea and the United States are trying to move the conversation in a forward-looking way, and I'm optimistic we'll get there, and in doing so, hopefully the trilateral discussions will equally move in that direction. Another point, I think we need to continue to multilateralize, if that's a word, multilateralize. Sometimes it's easier to do a 4-country grouping or a 5-country grouping than it is a trilateral. And that's okay, because within that setting of 4 parties or 5 parties or more, we can continue to strengthen trilateral cooperation. Certainly at the level of high-level dialogue, we take advantage of forums like the Shangri-La dialogue, the ASEAN defense minister meetings, to have Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense trilateral meetings. But I think at the operational level, doing exercises, doing other activities, multilateral, and bringing Japan and South Korea into the fold and finding opportunities to work three countries in those multilateral settings is important. I think 6, continue to look at new problems and continue to broaden the nature of the discussion. Maybe this is a sub-theme to force us into the future, but we don't have good answers to China's economic coercion. How do we deal with the fact that they're now boycotting Australian wine or Taiwanese pineapples? But guess what? South Korea has faced that with the sanctions against latte. Japan has faced that in terms of their supply chain integrity with rare earths. We need answers to these new challenges of how China is using its economic leverage for their political purposes. Look at emerging issues like the Arctic. Look at emerging issues like AI and space. So force us into the future, but also broaden the issue set we're looking at and look at the new challenges. And then finally, I would say, yes, the United States needs to continue to troubleshoot when necessary. You know, when this is hopefully doesn't sound contradictory to my earlier point about the United States not being a mediator, but there are times when we need to troubleshoot. And I think a good example of that was the discussion over Jasomia 2 years ago, where we were very close to a decision in Seoul to not renew that. And I, on a trip with Secretary Esper, very much encouraged him to raise it at the highest levels. He did, in fact, do that with Moon Jae-in. He did that with Prime Minister in Japan at the time, Abe. And I think, although primarily this was resolved between the two parties, I do think the United States played an important role in getting us to an outcome that would preserve that agreement. So troubleshooting will likely be necessary going forward, but that's just one aspect of what the United States can do. So with that, very, very happy to turn the floor over to my colleagues and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randall, and for kicking us off in a very good direction, expanding both, let's say, the pure security dimension, but other dimensions as well. I'd like to introduce Dr. Gina Kim. Dr. Kim is a research fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, KIDA, and an adjunct professor at Yonsei Graduate School of International Studies. She received her PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. At KIDA, she specializes in US-North Korean relations and nuclear non-proliferation issues. Among other tasks, she serves on the advisory committee for the Blue House National Security Office and the Policy Evaluation Committee for the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Seoul, and has previously also served on the advisory committee for the US-ROK Combined Forces Command. Dr. Kim has also written extensively on North Korea and the security situation in the wider Indo-Pacific region, one of her latest being Korea Peninsula and the Indo-Pacific power politics. So please, Dr. Kim, you have the word.
Thank you very much. I really thank the organizer for inviting me to this event. It's really my honor to be part of this dialogue. Well, I agree on most of the points that Randall made. In a press briefing held before the departure of Ambassador Song Kim and Acting Assistant Secretary Helvey, it was pretty much emphasized that South Korea, the US, and Japan share values. And Secretary Blinken mentioned cooperation with South Korea several times after US-Japan 2+2 meeting. And South Korea also notes that the US keeps on saying that nothing is as important as Korea-Japan relations. Well, actually, at the track 1 level, a lot of discussions are going on. However, at the track 2 level, there are some concerns about South Korea's contribution to the alliance, perhaps, well, because of lack of information and South Korea participated in the US-led multilateral security exercises more often than before, and South Korea increased the budget this year again for humanitarian aid and development project to help states in the Indo-Pacific region. And lots of things are going on actually. And after the 2+2 meeting in Seoul, ministries are trying to find similarities between the US strategy for the Indo-Pacific region and South Korea's policy toward this region as well. And because Japan is participating in strengthening its Indo-Pacific strategy with the US, I believe chances are high that the three countries will find some common interest. And because before COVID-19, South Korea pursued a new Southern policy, but now it expanded the scope of partnership to other regional countries, upgrading it to New Southern Policy Plus. So this partnership actually includes India. And South Korea seeks to strengthen defense cooperation with ASEAN countries as well. It seeks mutually beneficial cooperation that includes research and development, production, marketing, which is not limited to export of finished products. And South Korea plans to operate a regular defense consultation with other members of ASEAN to strengthen and expand PKO cooperation. South Korea is providing education and training based on MOU with regional countries, and these include education on anti-terrorism, clearing landmines, and etc. So what I'm saying is that we already have diverse activities going on, and it is time to share information among three countries so that we can avoid some redundancy of all these efforts. What factors are worsening the tension in the relationship between South Korea and Japan? Well, I believe there are two opposite forces in play. First, the centrifugal. Reserve the stance of the political leaders to solve the problem actively and move forward. That's the problem, as Randall already mentioned. Because South Korea is a democracy, the scope of government intervention is pretty much limited. Unfortunately, we actually missed the chance to peacefully solve some thorny issues in the past. It's very difficult for the government to get involved in some legal decisions, such as court rule on compensation for victims of forced labor, for example. Instead, South Korea offered an alternative option in the past, which is that once the Supreme Court ruling has been made, and if a Japanese company compensates the victims, then the Korean government can either compensate for those losses borne by the Japanese, or South Korean government can participate in creating funds to make some amends. However, this idea was not well received at the time. And on the other hand, Japan took government level responses to the Korea-Japan conflict, which was really unexpected for the South Koreans. That was restriction on the export of semiconductor equipment to South Korea. But South Korea's decision to bring this case to WTO was not intended to retaliate anyone. There was no real benefit actually for the South Koreans by doing so. It just aimed at changing Japan's position on this issue. And also the GSOMIA issue started because South Korea expected that it would cause some changes in Japan's attitude, or US coming to mediate between the two. So there was that kind of expectation among those who are handling this issue. So I think it is important to deal with some mistrust and misperception in the near future. Second, centripetal force. Deterring and defending threats from North Korea has always been binding us together. In our history, the scope and level of military cooperation between South Korea and Japan have been influenced by those external factors. For example, in June 2003, South Korea and Japan issued a joint statement following a summit. At the time, Korea and Japan agreed on principles of peaceful resolution of the North Korean nuclear issues. The US, South Korea, and Japan held a regular TCOC meeting to resolve the North Korean nuclear issues at the time. And Japan, Korea information sharing, military exercises such as anti-submarine and missile warning exercises were very, very active in 2017 when North Korea made us very busy with multiple missiles and nuclear weapons testing. So would it be possible to decouple security cooperation from non-security related cooperation? I believe there's that kind of possibility because decoupling of military issues from non-military issues with Japan has long been South Korea's position. And Moon Jae-in government has set the goal that it will promote both the resolution of historical issues and practical cooperation with Japan at the same time. When it comes to military cooperation in response to threats from North Korea, South Korea's national security strategy clearly mentioned that it will continue to strengthen strategic communication with Japan. And the principle is that the historical issues between the two countries should be based upon truth. But at the same time, South Korean government has set future-oriented, mature cooperative partnership as a key goal for its policy toward Japan. In South Korea is not pursuing formal military alliance with Japan. However, there are multiple forms of interactions indeed, information sharing between Aviation and Naval Operations Command and their counterpart in Japan, joint military exercises, commissioned education, and mutual visits, etc. It is possible, I believe, that we can revitalize all these means of cooperation between the two sides. The question about could Japanese behavior grow so threatening that South Korea abandons its hedge and decide to side with the US in the Pacific policy or join the Quad fully in the future? Well, I have no clear answer about that. After the Quad meeting, what the US emphasized was that it is not a consultative, it's a body against a particular country. However, the US emphasized the principle of freedom of navigation and freedom from coercion, which China is thought to be violating. So this is viewed as a strategic message to Beijing. And before visiting Japan, Secretary Austin stopped by the Indo-Pacific Command and visited India after his visit to Korea. Looking at all these visits, South Korea, I think, is virtually one of the pillars of strengthening the alliance network in the Indo-Pacific region. So I wonder whether South Korea's official participation to Quad or Quad Plus is that much important for the US. I also wonder Japan's position on inviting South Korea to the Quad. Well, it seems Quad countries have developed their own Indo-Pacific strategies, and that the scope and level of cooperation will be the product of some kind of, compromise. People in South Korea began to talk about the disadvantages of not participating in the Quad and the cost of participating in it. The comparison is very, very important because we have to determine what serves South Korea's national interest. Well, I personally believe first that if South Korea stays away from the US-led partnership, it could rather cause China's misunderstanding and misjudgment of the alliance. And second, South Korea should seek a damage limitation strategy somehow. Some believe that South Korea cannot move away from China because it has suffered retaliation against the THAAD deployment in 2017. However, when South Korea participates as a part of multilateral cooperation, we're talking about a different setting. By joining this multilateral security cooperation, I think South Korea can seek damage limitation strategy because South Korea's handling of China alone is very much different from acting together as part of the majority. Well, I'll stop here and look forward to more discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gina, for mentioning some of the really hot topics that we are discussing. One would be decoupling, and the other one would be the Quad. I think we will come back to these two issues in the Q&A session. And I'd like to invite our third speaker for today, Professor Michishita. He is currently the Vice President and Professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, in Tokyo. He is also a member of the National Security Secretariat's Advisory Board of the Government of Japan and a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. Previously, he served as a Senior Research Fellow at the National Institute for Defense Studies at the Ministry of Defense and Assistant Counselor at the Cabinet Secretariat for Security and Crisis Management of the Government of Japan. He acquired his PhD from SAIS, the Johns Hopkins University in Washington. Professor Michishita is an expert on Japanese foreign and security policy and security issues related to the Korean Peninsula. He has published several books and numerous articles, and one recent being Japan and South Korea, Friendly Foes of East Asia. Please, Professor Michi, you have the word.
Right, thank you very much for the kind introduction. So people keep talking about the current miserable relationship between Korea and Japan. So we tend to say, well, the relationship is not good. But today I would like to talk about the positive aspect of the Korea-Japan relationship. In that, I will talk about how two countries are important to each other. So first part, I will talk about how Japan has been contributing to the defense of South Korea. And in the second part, I will talk about how important South Korea is in Japan's security strategy today. So let me first talk about Japan's role to the defense of South Korea. So when we talk about alliance relationships, we say that the US-ROK alliance is there to defend South Korea, and the US-Japan alliance is there to defend Japan. But that's really not true. Militarily speaking, the most important objective or role that the US-Japan alliance plays is to defend South Korea. And in the context of the US-Japan alliance, Japan plays two critical roles for the defense of South Korea. How does Japan do it? First, the country provides and secures bases for US forces stationed in Japan. And this role started in 1950 when Japan started, the United States started to use bases in Japan in order to defend South Korea during the Korean War. And that role has continued to the present time. And let me just briefly, those who are not familiar with the situation, let me briefly, talk about what kind of major bases that Japan accommodates. So there is a big US Air Force base in Misawa in northern Japan. There is a US Air Force base in Yokota near Tokyo, US Navy Air Force base in Natsugi, and US naval base in Yokosuka. And there is in the western part of Japan, there is a Marine Air Force base in Iwakuni. And in Kyushu, there is a US Navy base in Sasebo. And in the beautiful resort islands of Okinawa, there is a Futenma Marine Corps Air Station, and Kadena, huge US Air Force base. So these are the bases that are indispensable to the United States, to South Korea, to Japan when it comes to the contingency on the Korean Peninsula. And so Japan provides these bases, and then and upon that, Japan provides and actually secures those bases. One of the most important roles that the Japanese Defense Force, called the Self-Defense Force, plays is to defend the US bases in Japan. And for that purpose, Japan has deployed two different missile defense systems. One is a sea-based upper tier exo-atmospheric system called SM-3. And the other one is a land-based endo-atmospheric defense system, lower tier system called Patriot PAC-3. And Japan has spent more than $2 billion for those systems. Sorry, $20 billion, 20? Yeah, $20 billion for those systems. And that's the first role that Japan plays. And the second role that Japan plays is that the country provides military operational support to US forces fighting for South Korea. So Japan did it during the Korean War. Let me show you. So Japan sent about 1,200 sailors to Korea to sweep mines under the command of the US 7th Fleet. And as a result, one sailor was killed in action on October 17, 1950. And these Japanese minesweeping operations contributed to the landing operations in Wonsan, which took place on October 25th, 6th, about 10 days later. When the Korean War ceased, Japan stopped playing this role. So for a long time, several decades, Japan was not, signed up for these operational roles during the Korean contingencies. But Japan decided to resume or start playing this role again in the late 1990s when the US and Japan revised its defense guidelines, which basically defines how the two countries, two armed forces share roles, missions, and capabilities in contingencies. And the Japanese Diet, this is the Japanese Parliament, in 1999 enacted the law called the Law for the Situations in the Areas Surrounding Japan, or SIAS-J law, which made it possible. This guy is the sailor who was killed in the minesweeping operation. So with the enactment of this law, the self-defense force was now capable of providing non-combat intelligence, transport, replenishment, and other support to the US forces operating for the defense of South Korea. Based on this new law, the US and Japan formulated the combined operation plan called O-Plan 5055. That made it possible for the self-defense force to conduct search and rescue operations, protect US bases in Japan, deal with North Korea's special operation forces, clear mines in high seas, and undertaking non-combatant evacuation operations. This Japanese operational role was further reinforced in 2015 when the Japanese Diet enacted a set of laws called Peace and Security Legislation. With this new law, Japan could now exercise the right of collective self-defense. What does it mean? The self-defense force can now shoot down ballistic missiles launched by North Korea aimed at Hawaii or Guam. The self-defense forces can now protect US military assets like US military vessels operating for the security on the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese forces can now sweep mines in the waters close to North Korea, even inside North Korea's territorial waters. So with the passage of 2015 laws, Japan's Korean wartime missions were fully revived. There is a challenge to the alliance and Japan's commitment to the defense of South Korea. How does it happen? It's happening because of North Korea's development of nuclear weapons and missile systems. North Korea has already deployed more than 200 medium-range ballistic missiles, as you can see on the screen, called Nodong, which is capable of hitting targets in most part of Japan. So it would be quite difficult. Well, it's becoming more difficult for Japan to remain committed to the defense of South Korea in wartime. So this is how Japan has been playing the role for the security of South Korea. Now, let me talk about how Korea is hopefully, in Japan's thinking, might be able to play a role in Japan's security strategy. So Japanese security strategy, one of the most important objectives of Japan's security strategy is to maintain the balance of power in this Indo-Pacific region in the face of a rising China. There are three pillars to Japan's security strategy. One is to strengthen its own defense capabilities. Second is to strengthen the US-Japan alliance. And the third is to enhance and bolster security cooperation with the countries in the region, such as Australia, Southeast Asian countries, India, and South Korea. In order to understand the importance of this cooperation, you can, let's take a look at this table, which basically lay down the 14, I cut it off at 15. So 15 countries with the highest military expenditure in 2019. I took this from a CIPRI report. And as you can see, the United States is the largest spender on defense in 2019, followed by China. And Japan is in the 9th place. And if you take a look at these figures here, change percentage in between 2010 and 19. So these figures represent the growth rate of defense expenditure in the past 10 years. So the US defense expenditure has actually declined by 15%, while Chinese one has increased by 85%, and the Japan's defense expenditure has increased by moderate 2.0%. So if you do a math, it's easy to understand how it might be difficult for the US and Japan, even if the two countries stick together, work very closely together, to keep competing with China. So what can we do? The answer is to bring in new partners. And if you take a look at India, South Korea, Australia, India, surprise, surprise, India is the 3rd largest spender on defense today. South Korea is the 10th largest spender on defense today, just after Japan. Australia is in the 13th place, and with its population of 25 million. So our thinking is, so if we can bring these countries together, we might not be able to outcompete China, but we might be able to maintain the balance of power very effectively in this region. So South Korea is a big strategic weight for us. So South Korea's strategic orientation will become one of the critical factors determining the balance of power in this region. And but certainly there are limits to what South Korea can do today, particularly because of its relationship, economic dependency on China. About, depending on when we calculate this, but about 13% of South Korea's gross domestic product comes from its export to China. So its South Korean economy is heavily dependent on China. So it would be difficult, as Gina mentioned, for South Korea to come on board this Quad or whatever Indo-Pacific Security Cooperation mechanism or the framework. But hopefully South Korea will come on board in time. And certainly, bad news is that Korea-Japan relationship is bad, but there are good news. I mean, U.S., Japan, and the South US-ROK alliances. I mean, these are critical to very important, I would say most important alliances in this region are highly interoperable. So whatever we say, we are capable of cooperating together if we make, or when I say we, Korea and Japan make a political decision to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michi, for giving us some perspectives from Tokyo